The courthouse in Red Hollow stood like a tired memory at the end of Main Street, its wood darkened by years of dust storms and winter winds. Most folks only climbed those steps when trouble forced them to. Ruth Calder climbed them every Thursday. No one knew why. The old woman moved slowly but deliberately, her black shawl wrapped tight around her shoulders, boots scraping softly against the worn steps. Inside, the courtroom smelled of old timber and forgotten arguments. She took her usual seat on the back bench. Same place, every week, every year. No one asked questions anymore. Time had turned her routine into part of the town itself. But Ruth remembered the beginning. She remembered the day the courtroom had been full, the day her voice mattered more than anyone else's, the day she chose fear over truth. And a faint tremor passed through her hands as she folded them in her lap. The sunlight coming through the tall windows illuminated the dust in the air, just like it had decades ago. Nothing inside this room ever seemed to change, except her. 40 years ago, she had stood before the judge and sworn to tell the truth. And then she hadn't. The lie had sounded small when she spoke it. Harmless, necessary. It had not been harmless. A man was taken away in chains before nightfall. Ruth still saw his face sometimes when she tried to sleep. Not angry, not pleading, just betrayed. The courtroom door creaked open behind her. Boot steps followed, steady, unfamiliar. The judge's voice carried across the room. "Deputy Hale, welcome to Red Hollow." Ruth's spine stiffened. Hale. The name struck like cold iron. She turned slowly in her seat, and the young deputy standing near the doorway had the same eyes as the man she helped condemn, and Ruth Calder knew the years she had borrowed were over. Deputy Thomas Hale noticed the old woman immediately. Most of the courtroom benches were empty, but she sat upright in the back row, dressed in black like she was attending a funeral no one else remembered. Her eyes followed him when Judge Collier called his name, though she quickly looked away when he met her gaze. Thomas had learned to read people during his years riding patrol in larger towns. Fear, anger, suspicion, they all showed themselves in small ways. What he saw in the old woman's face was something different. Recognition. After the brief introductions, the judge shook his hand firmly. "Quiet town," Judge Collier said. "Not much happens here anymore." Thomas nodded politely. "Quiet can change fast." The judge chuckled. "Not in Red Hollow." But Thomas wasn't listening anymore. The old woman was leaving. She moved carefully down the aisle, one hand brushing the bench as she passed. For a moment, he thought she might fall. Instead, she steadied herself and continued toward the door. Thomas felt a strange pull, the kind that came before instinct spoke. "Excuse me, ma'am," he said. She stopped. Slowly she turned. Up close, her face showed deep lines carved by time and something heavier than age. Her eyes searched his face with unsettling intensity. "You're new," she said quietly. "Yes, ma'am. Thomas Hale." The moment he said his name, the color drained from her face. Her fingers tightened around the small leather purse she carried. "I know who you are," she whispered. Thomas frowned slightly. Have we met before?" For a long moment, the old woman said nothing. The silence stretched between them like a rope pulled too tight. Then she shook her head. "No," she said, "but I knew your father." Thomas felt his chest tighten. "My father died before I was born," he said carefully. The old woman's voice trembled. "Yes," she replied. "I know." Thomas Hale stood still long after the old woman left the courthouse. The door had barely finished closing behind her, yet the air in the room felt different. Heavier somehow. Judge Collier cleared his throat behind him. "You'll get used to Ruth Calder," the judge said casually. "She's harmless." Thomas turned. "She comes here often?" "Every Thursday for longer than I can remember." "Why?" The judge shrugged. "Some people grow attached to places. Courtrooms, churches, graveyards are all the same after enough years." Thomas wasn't convinced. There had been fear in her voice when she said she knew his father. Not curiosity. Not memory. Fear. "What do you know about my father?" Thomas asked. Judge Collier hesitated, which told Thomas more than any answer could. "Only what everyone knows," the judge finally said. "Daniel Hale was tried here, long time ago." The words landed slowly. "Tried for what?" The judge sighed, already regretting speaking. "You'll hear the story soon enough. Small towns don't keep secrets well." Thomas didn't press further. He simply nodded and reached for his hat. Outside, Red Hollow looked unchanged from when he'd ridden in that morning. Dusty street, tied horses, storefront windows reflecting the afternoon sun. But something beneath the surface had shifted. Across the street, Ruth Calder stood beside a water trough, gripping its wooden edge like she needed it to stay upright. She wasn't drinking. She wasn't moving. She was watching him. When their eyes met, she quickly turned away and began walking toward the edge of town. Thomas hesitated only a second before following. The road led past the last few houses, toward a small, weathered cabin standing alone against the open land. Ruth reached the door and stepped inside without looking back. Thomas approached slowly. The cabin door remained slightly open. From inside, he heard her voice. Thin, shaken, almost pleading. "I thought you'd never come back." Thomas froze. She wasn't talking to him. Thomas did not knock. Not yet. He stepped back from the cabin door, unsure whether he had heard correctly. The voice inside had sounded fragile, almost broken. Nothing like the controlled woman he'd spoken to in the courthouse. After a moment, the cabin fell silent. Thomas turned and walked back toward town. If Ruth Calder knew his father, then someone else would too. Red Hollow was the kind of place where stories lived longer than people. The saloon was half empty when he entered. A few men sat at a corner table, their conversation fading when they noticed the deputy badge on his chest. The bartender, an older man with a gray mustache and careful eyes, wiped down the counter slowly. Thomas took a seat. "Afternoon," the bartender said. "Afternoon," Thomas replied. "I'm looking for information." "That depends on what kind." Thomas removed his hat and set it on the counter. "Daniel Hale." The cloth stopped moving. For a moment the bartender said nothing, and then he exhaled through his nose and set the glass aside. "That name hasn't been spoken in years." "He was my father," Thomas said. The bartender studied him carefully as if comparing two faces separated by time. "You've got his eyes," the man muttered. Thomas waited. Finally, the bartender leaned forward slightly. "Your father wasn't from here. Rode in one summer. Quiet man. Kept to himself. Then one night, a rancher was found dead outside town." Thomas felt the room grow still behind him. "What happened?" "There was a trial. Quick one. Witness testimony was clear." The bartender hesitated. "Too clear, maybe." Thomas's jaw tightened. "You believe he did it?" The bartender shook his head slowly. I believe fear makes people certain of things they didn't truly see. Thomas's pulse quickened. Who testified? The bartender looked toward the saloon window, toward the edge of town, toward the cabin. Ruth Calder. The name hit harder this time. Thomas stood. Behind him, one of the men at the table spoke quietly. She's been waiting for you longer than you've been alive, deputy. Thomas turned. What does that mean? The man didn't answer. He just slid a folded, yellowed newspaper across the table toward Thomas. Thomas opened it and saw his father's face staring back at him from 40 years ago. Thomas carried the newspaper out of the saloon like it weighed more than iron. The print was faded, the edges brittle from time, but the headline remained sharp enough to wound, "Local drifter convicted in rancher's murder." Below it, his father's face. Younger than Thomas was now. Calm. Almost distant. Yet he stepped into the fading afternoon light and read every word. The article described a heated dispute over grazing land. It mentioned a gunshot heard near the creek. It repeated twice that a credible witness had seen Daniel Hale flee the scene. Credible witness. Ruth Calder. Thomas folded the paper slowly. Something about it felt wrong. The language was too neat, the story too clean. Trials were rarely tidy, especially not murder trials in small western towns. He rode out to the old creek before sunset. The land was quiet except for wind brushing through dry grass. The water moved slowly over stones, indifferent to memory. Thomas dismounted and stood where the article claimed the body had been found. If his father had fled, there would have been tracks, signs of struggle, something. But what struck him most was the distance. From the creek to Ruth Calder's cabin was nearly half a mile, and partially hidden by brush. Thomas narrowed his eyes. Could she have truly seen clearly from that far? Or had she only said she did? A cold realization crept into him. Maybe the lie hadn't been complicated. Maybe it had been simple. He returned to town as the sky darkened into deep blue. Lights flickered on in windows along Main Street. Ruth's cabin, at the edge of town, glowed faintly from within. Thomas dismounted outside her door. This time he knocked. There was a long pause before the door opened. Ruth stood there, candlelight behind her casting shadows across her lined face. "You went to the creek," she said quietly. Thomas didn't answer. He held up the newspaper instead. "Why did you say you saw him run?" The candle flame trembled between them. Ruth's lips parted, but no words came. Then, barely above a whisper, she said, "Because I was afraid of the man who truly did." Thomas did not move from the doorway. The night air had cooled, but Ruth Calder's small cabin felt warm and close, filled with the faint smell of candle wax and old wood. The single flame on the table between them flickered as if it too were uncertain. "Afraid of who?" Thomas asked. Ruth stepped back slowly, allowing him inside. The floorboards creaked under his boots. The cabin was simple: a narrow bed, a stove, a table with 2 chairs. Nothing unnecessary, nothing new, a life reduced to survival. "I was younger then," Ruth said, lowering herself carefully into a chair. "Fear looks different when you're young." Thomas remained standing. "That fear sent my father to prison." Her eyes closed briefly, as if the words struck physically. "Yes." Silence followed, thick and unavoidable. Outside, the wind brushed against the cabin walls. "I didn't mean for it to go that far," Ruth continued. "I thought they would question me more. I thought someone else would speak up. I thought—" her voice faltered. "I thought the truth would find its way out without me." "But it didn't," Thomas said. "No." Her hands rested flat on the table, the skin thin and pale against the rough wood. "The rancher who died, Samuel Grady. He had enemies," she said. "Powerful ones. Men who owned land, men people depended on." Thomas listened carefully. "One of them came to my house the night before the trial," Ruth said. "He didn't threaten me directly. He didn't need to. He only reminded me how dangerous Red Hollow could be for a woman alone." Thomas felt anger rising in his chest. "Who?" he asked. Ruth shook her head immediately. "They're gone now. Most of them buried. Fear outlives people, Deputy." Thomas leaned forward slightly. "You're still afraid?" Ruth looked up at him, her eyes reflecting the candlelight. "No," she said quietly. "I'm afraid of dying before I fix what I did." Thomas studied her face. This was not a woman protecting herself anymore. This was a woman preparing for something. Then she reached into her purse and pulled out a folded document. "I kept this hidden for 40 years, she said. Thomas took it and saw a signature at the bottom that changed everything. Thomas stared at the paper in his hands. The ink had faded to a dull brown. But the signature at the bottom remained clear enough to read. Samuel Grady, the man who had supposedly been murdered. Thomas looked up slowly. "This is dated 3 days after the trial," he said. Ruth nodded once. "Yes." The document was a land transfer agreement, notarized, witnessed, and signed. It transferred a portion of grazing land from Samuel Grady to another rancher in town. But according to the records Thomas had just read in that newspaper, Samuel Grady had died before the trial even began. "That's not possible," Thomas said quietly. Ruth's voice was steady now, though her hands trembled slightly in her lap. "I saw him alive," she said, "the night before I testified." Thomas felt the air leave his lungs. "You're saying he wasn't dead?" "I'm saying," Ruth replied carefully, "that the body found near the creek was never clearly identified. The town was told it was him. We were expected to believe it." Thomas looked back at the signature. If Grady signed this after the trial, then someone lied about his death. Yes? And my father was convicted for killing a man who may not have been dead. Ruth's silence confirmed it. Thomas paced the small cabin, boots heavy against the wooden floor. His thoughts moved quickly now, pieces rearranging themselves into something darker. "Who benefited?" he asked. "If Grady wasn't dead, who gained from accusing my father?" Ruth's eyes lifted slowly. "The men who wanted his land," she said, "and the men who needed a scapegoat." Thomas stopped walking. "You believe it was planned?" "I believe," Ruth said softly, "that your father was convenient." The word lingered between them. "Oh, convenient." Thomas returned to the table and leaned over it. "Why keep this?" he asked, lifting the paper. "Why not bring it forward years ago?" Ruth swallowed. "Because I didn't know how deep it went. And because the man who made me afraid, he signed it too." Thomas's chest tightened. "Who?" Ruth's eyes darkened. "The man who became sheriff right after your father was sentenced." Thomas felt something shift inside him. The current sheriff's portrait still hung in the courthouse hallway, and it bore the same last name. Thomas barely remembered leaving Ruth Calder's cabin. The night air felt colder now, sharper against his skin, as if Red Hollow itself had changed. He walked back toward town with the document folded tightly in his hand, his thoughts racing faster than his steps. And the courthouse stood dark except for a single lantern burning in the hallway. Thomas pushed the door open. Inside, the wooden floor echoed under his boots. He moved down the corridor without hesitation, stopping in front of the wall of framed photographs. Every Sheriff Red Hollow had ever known. At the center hung the portrait he remembered. Sheriff Walter Boone. A stern man with narrow eyes and a thick mustache, captured in black and white decades ago. Beneath it, a brass plate read, Sheriff of Red Hollow, 1889 to 1908. Thomas studied the face carefully. "You see it now." The voice came from behind him. Thomas turned. Judge Collier stood at the end of the hallway, hands folded calmly in front of him. "See what?" Thomas asked. "The past you came here to find," the judge replied. Thomas lifted the document. Walter Boone signed this land transfer with Samuel Grady 3 days after Grady supposedly died." The judge's expression did not change. "That paper should not exist," he said quietly. "But it does." Thomas stepped closer. "My father was convicted based on Ruth Calder's testimony. If Grady wasn't dead, then the trial was built on a lie." Judge Collier sighed, the sound heavy with years. "Deputy Hale," he said, "small towns survive by letting old things stay buried." Thomas felt anger rise. "My father died in prison, and Walter Boone died 30 years ago," the judge replied. "That doesn't make it right." "No," the judge agreed. "It doesn't." Thomas looked back at the portrait. "Boone has family here, doesn't he?" The judge hesitated. That was all the answer Thomas needed. "Who?" Thomas asked. Judge Collier spoke slowly. "The sheriff." Thomas felt the realization settle like stone. Sheriff Daniel Boone, the man who hired him just 2 days ago. Behind them, the courthouse door opened. Heavy boots entered the hallway, and the sheriff's voice said, "Deputy Hale, we need to talk." Thomas did not turn immediately. The sound of Sheriff Boone's boots echoed slowly across the courthouse floor, each step measured, unhurried, the walk of a man who believed he was still in control of the room. Judge Collier lowered his gaze and quietly stepped aside. Thomas finally faced him. Sheriff Daniel Boone looked older up close than he had 2 days earlier when welcoming Thomas to Red Hollow. His gray hair showed beneath his hat, and deep lines framed his mouth, but his eyes were steady. "You've been asking questions," Boone said. Thomas held up the folded document. "I found answers." The sheriff nodded once, as if expecting it. "My grandfather," Boone said, glancing briefly at the portrait on the wall, "was a complicated man." Thomas's jaw tightened. "My father died because of him." Boone did not argue. "I know," he said. The simplicity of the admission unsettled Thomas more than denial would have. "You know?" Thomas repeated. Boone exhaled slowly and removed his hat. "When I was a boy, my father told me the story," he said. "Not the public one, the real one." Thomas said nothing. "Samuel Grady wasn't dead when the trial happened," Boone continued. "He was injured in a fight over land. My grandfather helped him disappear long enough to transfer property and settle debts." Thomas's grip on the paper tightened. "And my father?" "A stranger with no family in town," Boone said quietly. Someone the town could blame without consequences." The words landed like hammer blows. "Ruth Calder lied," Thomas said. "She was afraid," Boone replied. "My grandfather made sure of that." Thomas struggled to steady his breathing. "Why tell me now?" he asked. Boone met his eyes. "Because Ruth kept proof. And because I knew one day someone named Hale would come looking." Thomas felt anger and confusion collide. "You could have told me when I arrived." "Yes," Boone said, "but I didn't know if you wanted truth or revenge." The hallway fell silent. Then Boone reached into his coat and removed an old metal object. He placed it in Thomas's hand. A prison badge, Daniel Hale's number stamped into it. "I've been waiting to return this," the sheriff said. The courthouse was silent when Ruth Calder finished speaking. No one moved. No one whispered. Sheriff Boone stood with his head lowered. Judge Collier removed his glasses slowly, as if the room had grown heavier. Thomas Hale stepped forward. For a moment, Ruth looked afraid again, not of punishment, but of judgment, the kind that follows a person longer than law ever could. Then Thomas did something no one expected. He placed his father's prison badge into her hands. Ruth gasped softly. "My father lost his freedom," Thomas said, his voice steady but thick with emotion. "But you lost 40 years of peace." Tears slid down Ruth's face. "I don't deserve forgiveness," she whispered. Thomas shook his head. "This isn't forgiveness," he said. "It's the truth finally being where it belongs." Ruth's shoulders began to tremble, not with fear this time, but relief. The kind that only comes when a burden carried too long is finally set down. For the first time in decades, she stood without looking smaller than the room around her. Outside, the morning sun filled the courthouse windows with warm light. Life in Red Hollow would continue, but not the same, not after truth had returned. Thomas helped Ruth down the courthouse steps slowly. She did not look back. She didn't need to anymore. Some mistakes shape a life, but they don't have to define the ending. And sometimes, the bravest thing a person can do is tell the truth before time runs out. If this story meant something to you, if you believe it's never too late to make things right, subscribe for more Western stories about redemption, courage, and second chances.